Chapter 1. The extra place, the house of Harold Wexley, stood on the edge of the village, like a man with a secret upright, respectable, and too still. It was a square, well-kept house of pale brick, set back from the lane behind a sweep of gravel and two dark yews, clipped with such care that they appeared almost severe. On that wet autumn evening the windows shone through the mist with a yellow steadiness that made the rest of Brackenmere seem withdrawn and listening. The village itself had already folded into silence. Only Wexley House seemed awake, and even that wakefulness had in it something watchful rather than warm. I had been invited there to dine by Harold Wexley himself, a man of means and standing, whose name was spoken in the district with a mixture of respect and caution. He had made his fortune in shipping insurance, retired while still vigorous, and chosen for his final kingdom this careful house on the edge of the world. He lived there, I had been told, with his widowed sister, Mrs. Miriam Voss, and a reduced but efficient staff. A young solicitor from London, Mr. Edwin Marsh, was also expected that evening on some matter of business. As chance would have it, I was not the only guest. Staying with me in the village at that time was Hercule Poirot, whose fame had by then long ceased to surprise anyone but still possessed. For those who watched him at close quarters, the power to astonish. It was Harold Wexley who had urged me to bring him. He had done so lightly, with that manner of a man who wishes a thing done while pretending indifference to it. "If Mr. Poirot does not mind a quiet dinner in the country," he had said. "I should be honored." Poirot had accepted at once. He accepted, I think, not because the invitation pleased him, but because something in the wording of it had awakened his curiosity. Our host received us in the hall with perfect civility. Harold Wexley was a tall, iron-grey man with a heavy jaw, a smooth voice, and the guarded eyes of one long accustomed to weighing consequences. Before speaking, his handclasp was firm without cordiality. He wore evening clothes of admirable cut and stood very straight, yet there was an air of fatigue about him that no tailoring could conceal. "My sister is in the drawing-room," he said. "Mr. Marsh arrived a quarter of an hour ago." Mrs. Miriam Voss rose as we entered. She was a handsome woman in her middle 50s, dressed in black silk, relieved by a single string of pearls. She had the composed face of one who had suffered enough to become efficient in the management of feeling. Her eyes, however, were not composed. They moved quickly, restlessly, and more than once toward her brother, as though measuring his mood. Edwin Marsh was younger than I had expected. Perhaps 30, fair-haired, neatly dressed, with an agreeable, intelligent face that lacked only self-possession. He had good manners, but his fingers betrayed him. They moved often to his cuff, his glass, the edge of a paper knife on the table near him. A nervous man, I thought, or a man with something at stake. Conversation before dinner was easy enough on the surface. The weather, the roads, the state of the village church roof. These subjects were handled with competence and allowed to expire naturally. Yet from the beginning there was in the room a curious pressure, as though all 5 of us were waiting for some 6th presence not yet announced. It was then that Poirot became very quiet. When dinner was served, Wexley himself led the way into the dining-room, and I, following immediately behind Poirot, saw the thing at once. The table had been laid for 4 guests and the host. Yet we were only 4 at table with Wexley himself, making 5 persons in all. One place remained unused. A 4th chair on the far side stood drawn back by an inch, not enough to look accidental, but enough to suggest it had recently been touched. Before it lay a folded napkin, a silver knife and fork aligned with care, a glass already filled with water, and a bread plate upon which rested a roll untouched by any hand. No servant, having laid by mistake for too many, would have completed the setting with such deliberate exactness. It had been prepared for someone expected. Harold Wexley paused. It was no more than the fraction of a second, but it was visible. His gaze moved to that extra place and from it to the butler, who stood impassive near the sideboard. Poirot's eyes, bright and exact, rested not upon the host, but upon the unused plate. "Ah," he said softly. "Summoners prepared for a guest who was not meant to be seen." The remark, though gently made, entered the room like the point of a knife. Wexley gave a short laugh. A simple mistake. The butler did not stir. Poirot inclined his head. Naturally, but mistakes have so often an interesting origin. Mrs. Voss lowered herself into her chair with unnecessary care. Edwin Marsh, who had been about to sit, checked himself, then did so abruptly, knocking the leg of the table with his knee. The butler, after the briefest hesitation, removed the extra place. I noticed then a small detail that might have escaped another man. The water in the glass had not gone entirely still. It trembled faintly, as though the table had been touched only moments earlier. Dinner proceeded. The soup was excellent. The fish was overcooked. None of us would have remembered either fact had the company been at ease, but discomfort has a way of engraving trivialities upon the mind. Harold Wexley talked more than he had in the drawing-room, which in itself was revealing. Men who are naturally reserved do not become expansive at table unless they are attempting to control it. He spoke to Poirot of foreign travel, to me of village politics, to his sister of a charitable committee, and to Marsh of London rents. All the while the younger man replied properly, and too quickly, while Mrs. Voss said almost nothing at all. At length Poirot asked, in his most innocent tone, "You have lived here long, Mr. Wexley?" "Nearly 9 years. And always with your sister?" Wexley set down his wine-glass. "Since her husband's death." Mrs. Voss looked up. "Harold has been very good to me." "A family loyalty," said Poirot. "It is admirable." Wexley bowed slightly. "One does what one can." Poirot turned to Marsh. "And you, monsieur?" He checked himself. "Mr. Marsh, you are the legal adviser of our host." "For some months only," said Marsh. "I succeeded Mr. Calder after his retirement." "Ah yes, changes in professional arrangements may be useful. Fresh eyes, fresh methods." Wexley smiled, but not pleasantly. "I have no taste for drama, Mr. Poirot. My affairs are perfectly straightforward." "I am delighted to hear it," said Poirot. There was nothing in the words. It was the silence after them that mattered. When the second course had been removed, Mrs. Voss suddenly spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Did you expect anyone else this evening, Harold?" Her brother did not look at her. "Number." The answer came too promptly. She folded and unfolded the edge of her napkin. "I only asked because the table—" I said no. Again silence. Marsh dropped his fork. It struck the plate with a hard metallic note that caused him to flush. "Forgive me," he murmured. Poirot, who missed nothing, looked from one face to another with an air almost meditative. He seemed less like a guest than a collector of impressions, arranging each small reaction within that precise cabinet of his mind where nothing was ever lost. Coffee was served in the drawing-room. Rain tapped softly at the windows. Somewhere in the house a clock struck 9 with a tone unusually deep and solemn. Wexley stood with his back to the fire. Mrs. Voss sat very upright, one hand pressed flat against the arm of her chair. Marsh asked whether there might be cigarettes, though his untouched case lay in full view beside him. Then the servant entered. He was the butler, Graves, a man whose face had the polished blankness of one trained to remove himself from every domestic tension. Yet even he seemed altered now. "A note has arrived, sir," he said. He crossed the room and handed a small envelope to Harold Wexley. I saw at once that there was no stamp upon it. Wexley opened it. As he read, the color went out of his face so completely that for one instant he appeared not merely alarmed but old. His fingers tightened on the paper. "Well," said Mrs. Voss sharply. He looked at her, then at Marsh, then at Poirot. "It is nothing," he said, but Poirot had already risen. "No," he said quietly. "It is not nothing, and since tonight there is one place too many at table, I think perhaps there is also one truth too few in this house." Wexley's hand closed over the note. Outside, beyond the curtained windows, the darkness pressed close against the glass. Inside, by the firelight, no one moved. The mystery had begun. Chapter 2. Supper in uneased dinner proceeded, though no one truly ate with comfort. The removal of the extra place had not restored ease to the room. On the contrary, it had made the disturbance more definite. A thing once seen cannot be unseen. Though the butler had taken away the unused plate, folded napkin, and polished glass with admirable discretion. The table itself seemed still to confess the fact of expectation. One felt absurdly, yet unmistakably, that someone was missing who had been meant to be there. Harold Wexley resumed his seat with an effort at self-command that did not wholly succeed. He was a man practiced in governing both his household and himself. But there are moments when authority becomes only another word for strain. His hand, as he reached for his wine, was steady enough. It was his eyes that betrayed him. Twice, within the first few minutes, they traveled with almost involuntary precision to the place where the extra setting had stood. His sister, Miriam Voss, dealt with unease in another fashion. She began to talk. There are people who become silent under pressure. There are others who seek to smother tension beneath a rapid overflow of words. Mrs. Voss belonged decidedly to the latter class. She spoke of village charities, of blankets for the poor, of an unfortunate dispute over subscriptions for the church roof, of the need to reorganize the women's committee before winter. She spoke well, even intelligently, but too quickly, and with that false brightness which has less to do with cheerfulness than with resistance to panic. "We had the most tedious meeting on Tuesday," she said, turning toward me with a smile, too immediate to be natural. "Mrs. Leete insists on managing everything and understands nothing. She has a talent for confusion. I sometimes think half the energy of village life is spent in correcting the errors of enthusiastic women." Harold said, "Miriam." She checked herself, gave a small laugh, and reached for her glass. "Yes, yes, I know, you dislike personalities at table. It is a reasonable dislike," said Poirot mildly. His tone was gentle, yet it seemed to me that he had not truly replied to her words, but rather noted the necessity behind them. Edwin Marsh, the young solicitor, was scarcely more composed. He had the look of a man who had expected difficulty, and found instead something worse. Uncertainty, each time Harold addressed him directly. His fingers tightened about his knife or the stem of his glass. He answered civilly enough, but too promptly, as though anxious to avoid the delay in which thought might betray him. "You came down from town this afternoon?" Harold asked. Yes, on the 4:20 train." "No trouble with the papers?" "None. Everything is in order." In order was an unfortunate phrase. It seemed to fall heavily into the room. Mrs. Voss lowered her eyes. Harold's mouth hardened. Poirot, who was buttering a small piece of bread with exactness, lifted his head only slightly. "In legal matters," he observed, "what is in order is sometimes merely what appears so at first glance." Marsh gave a short, embarrassed smile. "That can happen, certainly. More often than one would wish," said Poirot. The servant entered with soup, and for a few moments the formalities of service imposed a kind of pause. It was then that I noticed the housekeeper, Mrs. Greeley, who had accompanied the maid to the table. She was a capable-looking woman of late middle age, broad-faced and trim in movement, with the air of one who had run households efficiently for years, and was not impressed by human weakness. Yet when her gaze fell upon the vacant area where the extra setting had stood, she started so visibly that the silver ladle struck the edge of the tureen with a sharp note. For one alarming instant, the vessel tilted in her hands. She recovered it at once. "Careful, Mrs. Greeley," said Harold, not sharply, but with a weight that turned the words into warning. "Yes, sir." The housekeeper's color had altered. She did not again look toward the far side of the table, yet her self-command, though rapidly restored, had undeniably failed for a moment. Poirot saw it. I knew he saw it, because his eyes moved to her face and remained there for precisely the length of time required to store the reaction in memory. When the servants had withdrawn, Harold said with forced good humor, "It seems my household has become jumpy. A storm in the air, perhaps." "There is no storm," said Mrs. Voss. "No, then perhaps only autumn nerves." He laughed. It was not a successful laugh. It had in it the brittle quality of something manufactured for immediate use and not expected to last. Poirot, who had touched little of his soup, folded his hands beside the plate. "A household," he said, "is rather like a watch. When one part is disturbed, the whole mechanism may show it." "Surely that is too elaborate a comparison for a dinner. Table mistake." said Harold. Poirot looked at him with an expression of courteous interest. "Did I say it was a mistake, monsieur?" The slightest pause followed. Harold replied, "I say so." "Ah." Poirot inclined his head. "Then I am informed." The words were harmless on their face, yet they left Harold visibly displeased. He turned to me and began speaking of the village boundary dispute, a matter so dull and so unsuited to the temper of the company that I suspected him of choosing it merely because it allowed no dangerous intimacy. I answered, as well as I could, though I confess my thoughts were less on parish maps than on the sequence of small dislocations unfolding before us. The fish course was served. Marsh dropped a fork and apologized. Mrs. Voss spilled a little wine and apologized. Harold dismissed both accidents with an impatience he tried to disguise as kindness. The room had by now acquired that oppressive self-consciousness in which every trivial movement gains significance. A cough sounds accusatory. A glance becomes an admission. One becomes aware not only of what is said, but of all that is being fiercely withheld. Poirot alone appeared at ease. This is something people often misunderstood about him, because he was methodical, because he loved order and disliked disorder. They assumed that tension in others must somehow infect him. The opposite was nearer the truth. Mental confusion in a room seemed to clarify him. Where others became embarrassed, he became attentive. Where others hurried to mend appearances, he waited. His silence at table that evening was not the silence of uncertainty, but of invitation. Mrs. Voss did so first. "Mr. Poirot," she said, "I believe you have solved some very extraordinary matters." "A few quite ordinary matters," said Poirot. "That they become extraordinary is usually the fault of the persons concerned." She gave an uneasy smile. "You make it sound as though crime was simply bad household management." "In many cases," said Poirot, "it is exactly that. Someone puts a thing in the wrong place. Someone says what should not be said. Someone believes a lie because it is convenient, and then finds the convenience expensive." Marsh glanced quickly at him. Harold cut into his fish with deliberate care. "And yet," he said, "I imagine a detective must sometimes see complexity where none exists." Poirot shook his head. "Number the amateur imagines, the professional observes. And what do you observe here?" I thought the question escaped Harold before he meant to utter it. The instant it was spoken, he seemed to regret it. Poirot smiled. "That the soul is a little overdone." Mrs. Voss laughed too loudly. Relief, however slight, passed round the table. Harold himself smiled. Marsh bent over his plate. The moment had dissolved. Yet I noticed that Poirot did not again taste the fish. With the next course the servants returned, and again Mrs. Greeley's composure appeared incomplete. She did not mishandle anything this time, but once, while placing a dish near Harold's elbow, she gave him a glance I found difficult to interpret. It was not insolent, nor pleading, nor merely anxious. It was the look of someone waiting to see whether a decision had been made. Harold met it with cold dismissal. "You may leave us." She withdrew at once. "An excellent housekeeper?" asked Poirot. "The best," said Harold. "She has been here 6 years. A long time. In the country one values reliability." "Yes," said Poirot. "One values it especially when surprises are unwelcome." Marsh took up his wineglass and found it empty. He set it down again without drinking. At length Harold seemed to decide that the situation could no longer be left to drift. He leaned back, looked from one of us to another, and spoke in a tone of deliberate carelessness. "You are all, I think, making too much of an absurd trifle. A place was laid by mistake, that is all. Graves should have checked it. Mrs. Greeley was inattentive. The matter ends there." No one answered at once. It was not that the explanation was impossible. It was that it landed badly, one felt, with immediate certainty that it had been prepared too late. An accidental fourth place might indeed be set, but accidents of that kind do not usually include precision. They do not draw back the chair. They do not fill the glass with water. And, as Poirot later told me, they do not usually include a folded note tucked beneath the fourth plate. I had not seen the note until that moment of recollection afterward, but Poirot had seen it then. He told me later exactly when. As Graves removed the extra place, his hand had lifted the plate just enough to reveal, beneath its rim, the corner of a small folded paper, laid flat upon the cloth. The butler, with excellent training and visible alarm, had covered it at once with the napkin and removed both together. It was a movement swift enough to escape nearly any observer. It had not escaped Poirot. At table, however, he gave no sign. Harold's explanation remained in the air. Mrs. Voss said, "Yes, of course, entirely a servant's mistake." But she did not sound convinced even by her own words. Marsh added, "Naturally, these things happen." Poirot dabbed his lips with his napkin. "Certainly," he said. "These things happen. One must not ask them why." Harold looked at him sharply. "You persist in finding drama where there is none." "Do I?" "Yes," Poirot considered. "Then perhaps I am wrong. It would not be the first time. Yet I confess that in my experience an uninvited place at table is rarely without intention. Hospitality is one of the most purposeful acts in the world. You make a philosophy of napkins and cutlery." Poirot spread his hands. The smallest objects are often the most eloquent. They do not know when to keep silent. There was something in Harold's face then. Anger, certainly, but touched by apprehension. It vanished almost at once. He spoke more lightly. "You must forgive my household, Mr. Poirot. Country life offers few excitements, so perhaps we have all become ridiculous." "Not ridiculous," said Poirot, "only uneasy." This time no one laughed. The remainder of dinner passed under increasing restraint. Mrs. Voss made another effort at social ease and failed. Marsh scarcely touched the dessert. Harold drank more wine than before, though never enough to impair him. Outside, the rain tapped intermittently at the windows, and a draught from somewhere in the corridor caused the candle flames to waver now and then in their silver branches, throwing the shadows of glasses and hands across the cloth in trembling miniature. When at last we rose and returned to the drawing-room for coffee, I felt that the true meal of the evening had consisted not of food, but of concealment. Each person had brought to table some private burden, and none had succeeded in laying it down. For several minutes no one spoke much. The fire burned steadily. Cups were distributed. Harold stood on the hearthrug, one arm on the mantel, with the look of a man waiting for the close of an ordeal not yet finished. Mrs. Voss sat near the lamp, her coffee untouched. Marsh, after accepting a cigarette, discovered that he had no match, though they lay before him in a silver box. Poirot took his coffee, smelled it with approval, and said to me in a low tone, "My friend, tonight the appetite is not for food, it is for certainty. Unfortunately, that is the one dish our host cannot serve." Before I could answer, the door opened and Graves entered. He carried no tray this time. In his hand was a small folded paper. "A note has been delivered, sir," he said. Harold turned. "At this hour?" "Yes, sir, by hand." There was a brief pause before Harold took it. His face altered as he read, not dramatically, but enough. The color went from it. His expression did not collapse. It tightened. Mrs. Voss rose half out of her chair. "Harold." He folded the note. "It is nothing." Poirot set down his cup very carefully. "No," he said. "It is not nothing," and the unease of supper, which had so far only circled the truth, moved at last toward its heart. Chapter 3. The note beneath the plate when the ladies withdrew. The room did not become easier. It became truer. During dinner, the presence of Mrs. Voss had imposed at least the shell of ceremony. Now, with the door closed behind her, and the murmur of her dress fading into the corridor, what remained was the bare structure of male unease. Harold Wexley standing rigid beside the sideboard, Edwin Marsh unable to decide whether to sit or move, and Poirot growing, if possible, even more still. Graves, the butler, began clearing the last of the table with his usual professional restraint. Yet I noticed that he was careful, almost excessively careful, when he reached the place where the extra setting had stood earlier. He did not look at Poirot. He did not look at anyone. His hands, however, betrayed a slight haste. Poirot noticed it as well. Then, with a movement so neat that it was almost invisible, he bent. He had dropped nothing. He was not adjusting a cuff or rescuing a napkin. He simply inclined himself for the briefest instant toward the far edge of the cloth, his fingers moving beneath the shadow of a wineglass and returning empty. Or so I thought at first. It was only when he resumed his seat and placed one hand lightly upon his knee that I saw half hidden in his palm a small folded paper. It had been tucked beneath the fourth plate. Graves turned away at that same instant with the coffee tray, and if he had seen the recovery of the note, he gave no sign of it. Harold Wexley was staring into the fire as though he expected an answer there. Edwin Marsh was looking at Harold. Thus it was that Poirot, with the deftness of a conjurer and the gravity of a judge, became the sole possessor of the hidden message. He did not open it at once. That was like him. He disliked haste in the handling of facts. He preferred first to understand where he stood, to allow a moment to settle around a thing before disturbing it. Only when Graves had withdrawn and the door was firmly shut did Poirot unfold the paper on the table beside his coffee cup. It contained only 5 words, written in a hurried hand. "I am coming tonight. Wait." There was no name, no hour, no signature. The message, brief as it was, seemed to alter the temperature of the room. Even I, who had only half expected something of consequence, felt the unmistakable movement of the case from strangeness into danger. Poirot read it once, then passed it to me. The handwriting was uneven and rapid, as if written under agitation or in concealment. The ink had blotted slightly on the second word. It was not a note meant to be treasured. It was meant to reach its destination and vanish. Harold turned. "What is that?" Poirot looked up. A communication which had, I think, the intention of remaining private. Wexley crossed the room in 3 quick steps and took the paper from my hand. His face did not change at once. He was a man too practiced in control for that. But something in him contracted. The jaw grew heavier. The eyes sharpened. "I know nothing of this," he said. Poirot, who was watching him closely, tilted his head. "Indeed." "It means nothing to me." The denial came too fast, too smooth. It had the quality of something prepared by instinct before thought had even arranged the facts. It was like a man stepping over rotten boards he already knows are there. Poirot held out his hand. "Will you permit me?" For a second I thought Harold might refuse. Then he returned the note, almost with irritation. "I tell you it is absurd. If a servant found it and put it under the wrong plate, that is no concern of mine." "Yet it was not found by a servant," said Poirot gently. "It was placed there. Then someone played a foolish trick." Edwin Marsh made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a breath. We all looked at him. He had gone very pale. Until that moment he had been merely strained. Now he looked like a man to whom something expected in nightmare had suddenly been presented in daylight. He put one hand on the back of a chair as though for support. "You recognize the writing?" asked Poirot. "No," said Marsh too quickly. "No, certainly not. Yet the message disturbs you." "It would disturb anyone." "Not equally," said Poirot. Harold turned sharply. "This is intolerable. Mr. Marsh is my guest." Poirot folded the note once more with exact care. "And I also am your guest, monsieur. That is why I ask rather than accuse." The tension between them had become palpable. Harold Wexley was no longer pretending that the matter amused him. He had the air of a man fending off an intrusion with sheer force of will. Marsh, by contrast, seemed divided between fear and some private calculation. His eyes moved once toward the door, an involuntary glance, but revealing. Poirot saw that too. Then Miriam Voss re-entered. She had evidently forgotten something, perhaps her handkerchief or the book she had left on the side table. She came in with quick steps, still speaking as she opened the door. "I left my—" She stopped. Her gaze fell first on Harold, then on Poirot, then on the note in Poirot's fingers. It was not the paper alone that struck her, it was the arrangement of faces around it. She understood at once that whatever had been hidden at dinner had now risen to the surface. "What is it?" she asked. No concern of yours, said Harold. But Poirot had already answered, with that frankness which in him was often the most merciful form of precision. A note, madame. It was concealed beneath the extra plate. Miriam stared. Beneath the... Poirot handed it to her. She read the 5 words. Her coffee spoon slipped from her other hand and struck the saucer with a clear metallic clatter that seemed unnaturally loud in the room. For 1 second, no one moved. Then she looked at her brother, Harold. His expression hardened. I have said already that I know nothing of it. She did not reply at once. There was in her face not only alarm but recognition, a recognition she struggled to suppress and failed to master completely. Edwin Marsh had turned even whiter. The fragile network of concealment which had survived dinner now seemed ready to split at any point. Poirot spoke quietly. It appears that someone intended to come tonight. The place laid at table suggests that the expected arrival was not wholly unknown in this house. The note confirms anticipation. Now we have only to determine by whom the guest was expected, and why the expectation produced fear. Harold said in a low voice, You are making far too much of a scrap of paper. Possibly, said Poirot, but scraps of paper have a habit of surviving where explanations do not. Miriam sank into a chair. This is madness. No, said Poirot. It is method. He might have said more. Indeed, I think he was about to begin one of those quiet, inexorable examinations by which he stripped falsehood down to its essential bones. But before he could put another question, a cry rang out from the far side of the house. It was not loud in the theatrical sense. It was worse than that. It was abrupt, shocked, and cut short, as if the person uttering it had seen something so final that speech could not continue around it. Miriam rose at once. Edwin dropped the chair he had been gripping. Harold himself started violently, and for the first time all evening lost command of his face. The cry had come from the direction of the study. Harold was the first through the door. We followed at once, Poirot, Marsh, Mrs. Voss, and I, down the short corridor lined with engravings, and through the half-open door at the end. The study lamp was lit. Harold Wexley lay upon the carpet. For the briefest instant, the mind refused the picture. One had seen him a moment before alive, tense, resisting, speaking. Now he was on his side near the writing desk. One arm bent under him, the other flung awkwardly outward, as though in a final attempt to break the fall. The back of his head showed a dark, terrible injury. Blood had spread across the grey, blue pattern of the carpet in a stain at once, shocking and oddly precise. Mrs. Voss gave a thin, strangled sound and caught at the doorframe. Edwin Marsh whispered, "Good God!" Poirot did not move toward the body at once. He stood still in the center of the room, his eyes sweeping everything: the desk, the hearth, the carpet, the overturned chair, the curtains lifting slightly in the night air. The window stood open to the dark garden. Rain had ceased, but the wet scent of earth and leaves came in sharply from outside. Beyond the sill stretched only blackness, interrupted by the pale glimmer of gravel and the bent shapes of shrubs under the autumn wind. "It was not open before," I said. It was now the voice of the investigator, firm, exact, and detached. "Do not touch anything." He knelt by Wexley's body and examined the wound without yet turning him fully over. On the desk nearby lay a bronze paperweight in the shape of a crouching lion. There was a smear of blood along one edge. Poirot looked at it, but did not pick it up. Mrs. Voss said, "Is he—" Poirot rose. "Yes." Win Marsh had backed toward the bookshelf, as though distance might protect him from implication. His face was almost grey. Yet what struck me even then was that his expression held not grief but dread. Poirot turned to him first, who cried out, I do not know. You were not here." "Number, new, madame." He faced Miriam. She shook her head. "We were all in the dining room. You know we were." "Not all," said Poirot. There was a pause. He looked toward the open window. "The person who came tonight," he said softly, "has arrived." No one answered. The curtain stirred inward again with the wind. Somewhere outside, in the darkness beyond the garden, a gate clicked faintly, as though moved by an unseen hand. Poirot bent and picked up, not the blood-stained paperweight, but something small and nearly invisible near the leg of the desk. It was a button black, dull, torn from a coat or glove. He placed it carefully on the blotter and straightened. "My friend," he said to me, "we have now two certainties. First, the extra place was no accident. Second, murder has entered this house by appointment. The study, with its books, fire, and shaded lamp, had the dreadful intimacy of a room that a crime has chosen for itself. Harold Wexley's orderly life had ended there in a single brutal stroke. Yet the greater violence, I felt, was not only in the killing but in the design behind it. Someone had written, 'I am coming tonight.' Wait, someone had indeed come, and somewhere in that dark house, among the living faces turned pale by lamplight, lay the knowledge of why. Poirot looked once more at the body, then at the window, then at each of us in turn. At last, he said, the truth begins to keep its appointment. Chapter 4. The locked room. That was not locked. The local inspector, Inspector Bell, arrived with admirable speed and the usual confidence of a man who mistakes energy for method. He came in a dark overcoat, still wet at the shoulders, carrying with him the smell of rain and the bracing certainty of official procedure. He was a square-built man with a reddish face, alert eyes, and the decisive manner of one who preferred a quick theory to a slow truth. His movements were efficient, his tone assured, and his first glance around Harold Wexley's study had in it less shock than appetite. A crime, one felt, was to him not merely a tragedy, but a field in which to demonstrate command. He greeted Poirot with professional politeness rather than warmth. "Mr. Poirot, I had not expected to find you here." Poirot bowed slightly. "Nor I myself, Inspector, yet here we both are." Bell gave the ghost of a smile, then turned at once to the business before him. Harold Wexley still lay upon the carpet where he had fallen, one arm twisted under him, the other outflung toward the hearthrug, as though in some final appeal to balance. The bronze horse from the writing desk, used, as it seemed, to strike the fatal blow, had been set aside on a sheet of blotting paper. The open window admitted a restless current of cold air. Beyond it, the garden lay black and slick beneath the faint shine of late rain. Inspector Bell crossed directly to the window, examined the latch, then the sill, then the ground outside. He crouched, stood, and turned back with the quick, satisfied expression of a man whose expectations have not yet been contradicted. "Well," he said, "it seems plain enough. Your man was attacked by someone who entered through the study window, struck him from behind, and escaped back the same way into the shrubbery." Mrs. Voss gave a small, involuntary sound. Bell turned to reassure her in the tone officials reserve for distressed ladies. "Perfectly understandable, ma'am. A burglar startled, perhaps, or someone with a grudge. But he came from outside. That much is obvious." Poirot, standing just within the doorway with his hands behind his back, frowned, not at the window, but at the carpet. I had seen that expression before. It was the face he wore when confronted, not by complexity but by oversimplification. "Obvious?" he repeated gently. Bell nodded. "The open window, the forced latch, the state of the room. The thing explains itself." Poirot's eyes moved at last to the sill. "Does it?" The inspector was too occupied with his own momentum to hear the danger in that mild inquiry. He bent again toward the latch. It had indeed been damaged. One side of the fastening was splintered and bent back, as though pried by a knife or a flat instrument. "There you are," said Bell. "Forced entry." Poirot did not approach. "From which side, Inspector?" Bell glanced over his shoulder. "From outside, naturally." "Why naturally?" Bell straightened. "Because that is how intruders enter houses." Poirot's head tilted a little, and yet wood, like people, records the direction of violence. The inspector's expression altered slightly. He leaned closer to the window, this time more carefully. The splintering of the wood spread inward rather than out. Tiny fibers lifted toward the room. Not toward the garden, Poirot said quietly. The latch has been forced, yes, but from the inside, not the outside. Bell said nothing for a moment. I confess that until Poirot spoke, I had not understood the significance of the damage. Now it seemed obvious enough. Though only after being pointed out, the mark of leverage lay within the room. A person attempting entry from the garden would have bruised the wood differently. Someone inside the study had broken the fastening, and then opened the window. Certainly, said Poirot. Anything could have happened during a struggle. The question is what did happen. The inspector moved next to the carpet, lowering himself to inspect the area between the window and the body. His briskness had become a little less fluid. If the man came through here, he said half to himself, there ought to be traces. Yes, said Poirot, there ought. Bell's gaze sharpened. The garden paths outside were thick with rain. I had seen them myself when we arrived at the house, darkened gravel, soaked earth, and patches of loosened mud beneath the shrubs. A man crossing that ground and climbing through the window should have brought the garden in with him. Yet the carpet between sill and desk showed no muddy prints at all, no heel mark, no damp smudge, no broken line of wet across the woven pattern. There were only the impressions made by the occupants of the room earlier in the evening and, near the body, the slight disturbance caused by the fall. Bell rose again, slower this time. No footprints, he said. Poirot nodded. And no splashed earth on the curtain hem. No grit on the sill. No leaf pressed into the carpet. Our murderer, if he entered from outside, was a person of extraordinary cleanliness. Inspector Bell disliked that. One could see it. He was not offended by contradiction exactly. He was offended by contradiction made elegant. He walked to the desk where the bronze horse lay. It was a heavy decorative object, perhaps 8 inches high, with one foreleg lifted and the head thrown back in a spirited pose. Along one side of the base there remained a dark, sticky stain. The weapon at least is plain enough, he said, picked up from the desk in a moment of impulse. Poirot came forward then, but only a pace. Perhaps, yet impulse also has its habits. Bell glanced at him. You think the thing planted? I think nothing yet, I observe. The inspector took out a handkerchief, then thought better of touching the bronze directly. No clear print, he muttered. Either wiped or handled badly enough to blur. It is very often the case, said Poirot, that when a weapon yields no useful mark, it has first yielded too much intention. Bell looked up, meaning. Poirot spread his hands. A killer in real panic seldom pauses to compose his scene. He strikes, perhaps again, perhaps wildly, and flies. Here we have one controlled blow from behind. A neatly broken latch, an open window, and a conveniently visible weapon. It is arranged to resemble panic, but murder that is real is not always disorderly. Staged murder nearly always is. That sentence seemed to settle into the room with uncomfortable permanence. Mrs. Voss, who had been sitting motionless near the bookshelves, turned her face toward Poirot. Edwin Marsh, standing a little apart from us, swallowed visibly. His eyes had fixed themselves not on the body but on the window, as though trying to understand how a route of escape had failed him merely by being examined. Inspector Bell, to his credit, did not bluster. He only became more cautious. You suggest, then, that the murderer was in the house? I suggest, said Poirot, that the house is where the evidence wishes us to remain. Bell began at once to put questions. Who had last seen Harold alive? Who had heard the cry? Who had entered the study first? These inquiries, though sensible, had a mechanical quality beside Poirot's quieter attention to detail. Mrs. Voss stated that after dinner she had gone only briefly toward the drawing-room and then returned. Marsh said he had not left the dining-room until the cry. Graves, the butler, when summoned, insisted he had been in the pantry arranging the coffee service. Mrs. Greeley had been upstairs with the maid, or so she claimed. No one, it seemed, had seen anyone enter the study. Bell took notes rapidly. No sign of robbery, he said. Pockets untouched, desk drawers apparently in order. Poirot turned at that, apparently. Bell gave a short shrug. You think something missing? "I think," said Poirot, "that rich men do not die beside desks without their papers becoming interesting." That led naturally to the writing table itself. Harold Wexley's desk was a large one, handsome and severe, arranged with the precision of a man who liked his affairs visible and controlled. The blotter sat square. 2 pens lay parallel. A tray of letters had been sorted into 3 piles, yet one drawer, half an inch open, interrupted the symmetry. Poirot noticed it before anyone else. "Inspector?" Poirot asked Graves. The butler hesitated. "I could not say, sir." Mrs. Voss spoke from behind us. "Harold kept the key on his watch chain in the daytime, in the evening." She stopped. "In the evening," said Bell. "I do not know." Poirot's eyes moved to the dead man's waistcoat. The watch chain remained, but the small secondary key that might well have hung from it was not present. Bell made another note. The room itself, under continued examination, grew less and less like the scene of an interrupted intrusion, and more like something deliberately composed. A chair had been overturned. Yes, but in a direction that did not accord with Wexley's fall. A paper knife lay on the hearthrug. Although no paper on the desk had recently been opened with it, the curtain nearest the window had been dragged half off its ring as if seized in haste. Yet the fold of fabric had no corresponding tear. Each sign of struggle, considered separately, was possible. Together they became theatrical. Poirot stood once more in the doorway and surveyed the study as a whole. "It is too explanatory," he murmured. Bell, writing, said, "I prefer that to the opposite." "But truth rarely prefers either extreme," said Poirot. "When men stage confusion, they overstate it. They are like poor actors who fear the audience will miss the point." The inspector closed his notebook. "Then let us have your point." Poirot looked at the body, the desk, the open window, and finally at the faces gathered there. "Very well. Someone wished us to believe 3 things at once. First, that Harold Wexley received a secret visitor. Second, that this visitor entered from outside. Third, that the crime happened in sudden alarm. I believe only the first." A silence followed. Mrs. Voss gripped the arm of her chair. Marsh lowered his eyes. Graves remained expressionless, though the skin near his temples had tightened. Inspector Bell said, more soberly than before, "And the rest?" "The rest," said Poirot, "is arrangement." Outside, the wind moved through the wet shrubs with a whispering sound. The window stood open on darkness, but it no longer looked to me like an entrance. It looked like an argument, and arguments in murder as in life are often strongest where they are least true. Poirot bent once more over the carpet near the desk and lifted from it a thread too small for me to identify at that distance. He held it to the light. "Red silk," he said softly. Bell stared. "From what?" Poirot slipped it into an envelope without answering. Then he turned to me with that grave, almost melancholy expression he wore when the pattern of human deceit had begun to show itself. "My friend," he said, "the locked room is always impressive, but the room that was not locked and wishes to pretend it was invaded, that is often more interesting." Chapter 5. 3 people. And a missing man by midnight. The house had lost all resemblance to a private home and acquired the strained impersonality of a place under inquiry. Lamps remained lit in rooms, usually dark at that hour. Doors stood open that ought to have been closed. Servants moved in whispers. The ticking of clocks, insignificant at ordinary times, seemed now to measure not the passage of minutes, but the slow exposure of concealed things. Inspector Bell established himself in the morning room with admirable firmness and a quantity of paper which suggested that he believed order could be imposed by multiplication of notes. One by one, statements were taken, times were compared. Distances in the corridor were discussed. The cry from the study was recalled and recalled again, each repetition making it no clearer. Bell's method, if not subtle, was energetic. He wished to build the case from the moment of death outward. Poirot wished to do the opposite. He drifted through the business of the inquiry with apparent mildness, asking little, interrupting rarely, and yet somehow compelling each answer to reveal more than the speaker intended. By 12:30, he had already achieved what Inspector Bell, with all his direct questioning, had not. He had discovered the name of the person who had hovered over the dinner table without once being mentioned. It came first from Mrs. Voss. She sat upright on a narrow sofa in the drawing room, her hands linked tightly in her lap. The elegance of her appearance remained, but fatigue had sharpened her face and stripped it of social armor. Her eyes, which earlier had darted about the room, now rested mostly on the fire, as if she feared the effect of meeting another's gaze too long. Poirot stood before the mantelpiece. "Madame," he said gently, "there was tonight an empty place laid at table. There was beneath that place a note saying, 'I am coming tonight. Wait. Your brother is now dead, since silence has already cost enough. Let us not give it more power than it deserves.' For whom was that place prepared?" She did not answer at once. I saw the struggle in her plainly. It was not the reluctance of guilt, at least not entirely. It was also the reluctance of long habit, the habit of preserving family dignity, of sealing old disasters in respectable language, of telling oneself that the past is over because one has ceased to speak of it. "At last," she said, very quietly, "for Jonah Reed." Inspector Bell, who had been standing near the writing table, looked up at once. "Who is Jonah Reed?" Mrs. Voss closed her eyes briefly before replying. "He was my brother's business partner." Thus the name entered the case. The story, once opened, came in fragments at first, and then in a more coherent line. 5 years earlier, Harold Wexley had been one of 2 principals in a shipping and insurance venture in London. The other had been Jonah Reed. Bell had not heard of him. I had only the faintest recollection of some old financial scandal half noticed in the papers. Poirot, however, gave the smallest nod, as though a dim memory had just taken shape. "The firm collapsed," he said. "Yes, under suspicion of fraud." Mrs. Voss's fingers tightened. There were inquiries. There was ugly talk. Accounts were questioned. Money could not be traced. Investors lost heavily. And Mr. Reed, he vanished. Inspector Bell leaned forward. Vanished how? She gave a helpless little motion. No one knew. He disappeared. Some said he had fled abroad. Some said he had drowned himself. Some said worse things. After a few months, people ceased to speak of him. "But your brother remained," said Poirot. A faint color rose in her face. Harold faced the matter. He settled what he could, fought off the ruin of his name, and began again. It took years. But yes, he remained. Poirot's eyes did not leave her, and Mr. Reed's name bore the larger share of blame. She said nothing. It was answer enough. Later, in the morning room, Edwin Marsh supplied the rest, though not willingly. He was by then in a most uncomfortable state, exhausted, frightened, and painfully aware that what he knew should perhaps have been said earlier. He sat opposite Inspector Bell with both hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles had whitened. "You are Mr. Wexley's solicitor?" Bell asked. "For the last few months only. I took over some of his affairs after Mr. Calder retired." "And you knew of this Jonah Reed?" Marsh hesitated. Poirot, who was seated a little apart with his eyes half closed, opened them and said in a voice barely above conversational level, "You knew enough to be afraid when you saw the note." Marsh swallowed. "Yes." Bell's pencil stopped. "Go on." "I found something," said Marsh. "Not at first. Only recently. I was going through old company papers connected with a land transfer and came upon a packet that should have been destroyed or locked away separately. It contained statements, correspondence, drafts of agreements, material from before the collapse. Material showing what? That losses had been reassigned. Certain liabilities, bad ones, had been transferred on paper so that they would attach to Reed rather than to Wexley when the accounts were reviewed. Bell stared. "You mean Wexley dumped the damage on his partner?" Marsh looked miserable. "I mean the papers suggested exactly that." There was a silence. Poirot asked, "Were the transfers lawful?" Marsh gave a bitter little laugh. "Lawful, conceivably, if one ignored intention, honest." "Number, did you confront Mr. Wexley?" "Yes, 2 days ago. And he said I misunderstood the documents." Then he said such things were common in business. Then he told me, very plainly, that if I valued my position, I would leave old papers alone. Inspector Bell said, "Why did you not go to the police at once?" Marsh flushed. "Because the matter was old, incomplete, and perhaps not provable. Because I was not certain. Because—" He broke off. "Because," said Poirot. "Because I thought someone else already knew." "Jonah Reed." Marsh nodded. It emerged then that a letter, unsigned, but unmistakably personal in tone, had reached Marsh in London 3 days earlier. It contained no accusation, only a warning that the truth of the old collapse was not buried, and that Wexley would soon be forced to answer for it. Marsh had said nothing, hoping first to clarify the legal position. Instead, he had come down to Bracken, mere at Harold's request, and found himself at a dinner table laid for an invisible guest. "So," said Poirot softly, "Mr. Reed had reason to hate Mr. Wexley, and Mr. Wexley had reason to fear his reappearance." Bell wrote this down with energy, clearly pleased at last to have what seemed a straightforward motive. Yet the matter did not end there. Poirot returned to Mrs. Voss. "You said Reed was once close to the family." Her face changed. It was the first time that night emotion, rather than restraint, visibly mastered her. "He wished to marry me." There it was. Not merely scandal, but personal history. Jonah Reed had not been a remote business associate. He had been a man admitted to the house, trusted, perhaps loved. Mrs. Voss, then Miriam Wexley, had been young. Reed, she said, had been clever, ambitious, and not at all the reckless villain later described in gossip. He had quarreled bitterly with Harold after the firm's collapse. He had accused Harold, in her presence, of cheating him out of his share and fastening the ruin upon him. Harold had called him unstable and dangerous. Within a week Reed was gone. "And you believed whom?" Poirot asked. She stared into the fire. "My brother." "Entirely." At that she gave him a look almost of gratitude, as though his question had granted her the dignity of complexity. "No," she said, "not entirely." Bell, impatient with feeling, cut in. "Did you expect Reed tonight?" "Number, but the place at table. I did not lay it." "Who did?" She shook her head. "I do not know." This answer, too, carried more truth than certainty. In that house, I think, many things were known in parts by several people, and wholly by none. It was after this that Poirot asked permission to examine Harold Wexley's desk more closely. Inspector Bell allowed it with some reluctance, as if granting a colleague's request, while hoping secretly that nothing would come of it. The locked drawer, whose key was still missing, was eventually opened by force under Bell's supervision. Inside were neatly arranged papers, 2 personal ledgers, a small revolver unfired, several letters tied with ribbon, and 1 long envelope containing banknotes. Bell counted them twice. £500, he said. That was no trivial sum to be lying ready in cash in a desk drawer in a country house. Beside the envelope lay a folded railway timetable. It had been marked in pencil against the final trains for that very night. The London line inward, and a branch connection northward. 1 departure time had been ringed twice. Poirot took the timetable and studied it for a long moment. "Interesting," he murmured. Bell said, "Money for blackmail, perhaps." "Perhaps," said Poirot, "or for flight or for help. Money is a very obedient servant of motive. It can be ordered to play many roles, but the marked train matters," I said. "Yes. Hastings, the marked train always matters when a man dies before taking it." He turned the paper over. On the reverse side, pressed faintly into the card by a heavy hand writing on the sheet above, were half-visible indentations. Poirot moved it under the lamp. I could distinguish only fragments, a capital J, a number, perhaps part of a name or address, Bell said. "Can you read it?" "Not yet. But it has been used as support for a note, and that note may tell us more than the timetable itself." He returned to the money. "If Wexley expected Reed, why keep cash ready?" Bell asked. "To pay him," said Marsh at once. "To send him away," said Mrs. Voss from the doorway, where she had reappeared, white-faced and wakeful. Poirot looked from one to the other. "And if Reed expected not money but justice?" he asked. No one answered. That silence was different from the earlier ones. Before, silence had protected deception. Now, it sheltered possibility. Jonah Reed, the missing man, had suddenly become the center around which every other fear revolved. He was absent, yet more present than any living person in the house. Bell, now thoroughly engaged by the hunt for a fugitive, declared that circulars would be sent at once and stations notified by morning. A vanished business partner with motive and a note announcing his arrival was, to his mind, nearly as good as a confession. Poirot was less impressed. He stood at the desk, the railway timetable in one hand, the envelope of money in the other, and his expression was not one of triumph but of concentration. "So," he said at last, "our absent man was expected by at least one person, and his arrival frightened everyone." "Because he killed Wexley," said Bell. Poirot replaced the money carefully. "Maybe." The inspector frowned. "You have a better theory. I have a better question. If Reed came to kill, why announce himself? If Wexley feared him, why keep money ready, rather than summon police? Why lay a place at dinner for a man one believes capable of murder? And why, above all, stage an entrance through the window when the front door of memory was already open?" Bell made an impatient sound. "But I saw that the questions had touched him." Poirot continued, almost to himself. "3 people tonight are linked to Jonah Reed in 3 different ways. Harold Wexley feared him. Miriam once cared for him. Edwin Marsh discovered papers that might vindicate him. When one missing man can disturb a house so completely, without yet being seen, it means he is not merely a suspect, he is a reckoning." He put the timetable into his pocket, then glanced toward the dark corridor beyond the room. "Find Reed." "Yes, certainly. But do not make the common error, Inspector. A missing man is not always the murderer. Sometimes he is the thing for which the murderer has been waiting." The house had grown quieter by then. The servants had retreated. The body had been removed from the study, yet the atmosphere was heavier than before, as though the revelation of Jonah Reed's name had not relieved mystery but deepened it. Somewhere in the village, perhaps, or on some road between station and house, or nowhere near Brackenmere at all, there existed the man whose return had been expected at table and feared in private. 5 years of silence had prepared his entrance better than any dramatic speech. Poirot, as we at last went upstairs, said to me in a low voice, "My friend, we now have the old scandal, the hidden papers, the money, and the marked train. Very good, but the most important fact remains this. Everyone feared Jonah Reed, yet no one speaks of him as if he were dead. That means they have each been living, in one way or another, for 5 years in expectation of this night." "And you think Reed came?" Poirot paused on the landing. "I think," he said, "that someone wanted us very much to believe he did." Chapter 6. The servants speak morning. In a house after murder is never truly morning. The clocks strike, trays are carried, doors open and close, yet all ordinary sounds seem changed by the knowledge that death has entered and not yet finished speaking. At Wexley House the servants moved more quietly than usual, but not from mere grief. They moved, I thought, with the caution of people who know that what they say next may alter the fate of the living. Inspector Bell began the day energetically, and with a theory already too tidy for my liking. Jonah Reed, the vanished partner, had returned, found entry to the house, confronted Harold Wexley, and killed him. It was a theory with action, motive, and a convenient absence. Bell liked it at once. Poirot did not. "The dead man and the missing man are always attractive," he said to me. "One cannot question the first, and one cannot contradict the second. That is why careless minds prefer them." He asked first to speak with Mrs. Greeley, the housekeeper. We found her in the still room directing breakfast arrangements with quiet firmness. She was pale from lack of sleep, but her movements were competent and exact. She had the face of a woman who had spent half a lifetime managing other people's disorder and had formed a low opinion of it. Yet when Poirot mentioned the dinner table, something in her expression shifted. "Mrs. Greeley," he said gently, "you were alarmed last night before Mr. Wexley was found dead. You saw the extra place and nearly dropped the tureen. Why? She drew herself up. It startled me, sir. Yes, but not because it was unexpected, because it was expected too well. Her hands folded over the edge of the tray tightened. At last, she said, someone asks it plainly. Inspector Bell leaned forward, then out with it. Poirot gave him the smallest glance and turned back to her. You laid the fourth place. No, sir. I told the maid where it was to go, but the order came from Mr. Wexley himself. Bell looked up sharply. He told you to set for an extra guest? Yes, sir. Yesterday afternoon, he said a late guest might arrive, and that the place was to be ready without comment. Did he name the guest? No, sir. Did he seem troubled? She hesitated only a second. He seemed angry in the way a man is when he is frightened and means to hide it. Poirot nodded, as though this confirmed something already half settled in his mind. Then the extra place was no mistake. No, sir. Bell scribbled in his notebook with satisfaction. Good, very good. Poirot, however, was not finished. You believed the place would remain. Mrs. Greeley glanced toward the door before answering. I believed it might be removed if the guest did not come, but I did not expect it to disappear so quickly once you were seated. Bell frowned. Why not? Because Mrs. Voss changed the seating cards herself just before the meal. That arrested us all. Changed them, said Poirot. Yes, sir. We had laid the places one way in the afternoon. Then, not 10 minutes before dinner, Mrs. Voss came in alone and altered them. In what way? She moved Mr. Marsh one seat farther down and changed the fourth place to the far side of the table. Poirot's eyes sharpened. So the hidden guest was not meant to sit where first intended. No, sir, Bell said impatiently. That is social fiddling. Women do it. Poirot did not look at him. Sometimes, and sometimes they do it for reasons. He next asked for the butler. Graves, it seemed, had been called Thomas Vale in earlier service, and was known by both names in the household. He was a tall, controlled man with the impersonal bearing of one trained not merely to serve, but to erase himself. Yet even he could not wholly conceal strain. Mr. Vale, said Poirot, you heard something before dinner. The butler's expression did not change, but I saw a flicker in the eyes. I heard voices, sir. From where? From the study. Whose voices? Mr. Wexley's certainly, the other I could not swear to. Bell broke in at once. A man's voice. I believe so, sir. You believe. It was low, sir. The study door was nearly shut. Poirot's tone remained calm. What words did you hear? Valor answered after a pause. Mr. Wexley said, You fool for coming back. That sentence seemed to hang in the room. Bell looked almost triumphant. There, then Reed returned, Poirot said quietly. Perhaps. Did you hear the other voice answer? No, sir, only something indistinct, then silence. And no visitor had been announced. No, sir. No knock at the front door. No hat or coat given into your charge. None. Bell's satisfaction dimmed. Then how did this person get in? That question led to the old back passage. Mrs. Greeley told us of it first. A narrow service corridor, long little used, running from the old pantry wing toward a side door near the study. In former days it allowed trays, coal, and other necessities to pass discreetly, without crossing the main hall. In recent years it was usually kept shut and bolted. This morning, she said, I found it unbolted. Bell stared. You're certain? Yes, sir. I noticed because I had locked it myself 2 nights ago. Poirot asked. And last evening. I did not check it. The passage itself was soon examined, narrow, dim, lined with old wood and smelling faintly of dust, polish, and damp stone. One could indeed reach the study side without passing the front door or entering the main hall. It was an excellent route for someone who knew the house. Bell turned to Marsh. Did you know of this? Widwin Marsh, already strained, gave an unwilling nod. Yes. How? I came across it while reviewing old house plans during a property matter last month. Did you mention it to anyone? I may have referred to the plans in conversation, I don't remember. Did Wexley know you knew? Yes. Bell looked pleased again. Here was opportunity, access, knowledge. Marsh saw it in his face and went paler still. Poirot, however, seemed interested in something else entirely. He returned to Mrs. Greeley. When Mrs. Voss altered the seating, was anyone with her? No, sir. Did she say why? Number. And the extra place. After she moved it, where did it stand? Directly opposite Mr. Wexley. Poirot was silent for several seconds. Thank you, he said at last. When we were alone, Bell said. Well, it's plain enough now. Wexley expected Reed. Reed came secretly by the back passage. Wexley confronted him. Then later, after dinner, he was killed. Poirot shook his head. My dear Inspector, you have gathered facts only to return at once to your original story. That is not method. It is appetite. Bell reddened. What else do you want? Poirot counted on his fingers. First, Harold Wexley ordered the extra place himself. Second, no stranger was seen entering by the front. Third, someone was heard in the study before dinner. Fourth, the secret passage was available. Fifth, and to me most interesting, Mrs. Voss changed the seating just before the meal. Bell shrugged. And, said Poirot, people do not alter seating at the last minute unless they wish one person to observe another or to prevent it. He looked back toward the dining room as though he could still see the empty place shining there under candlelight. The servants have given us what the family would not intention. Harold expected someone. Someone reached the study unseen. Miriam interfered with the arrangement. Edwin knew the hidden way. Already, the house has ceased to be a stage for a stranger's revenge. It is becoming what it truly is, a house in which several people prepared, each differently, for the return of one absent man. And you think Miriam mattered more than Reed? Poirot folded his hands. I think, he said, that when a woman changes where people are to sit, she is not arranging dinner. She is arranging sight lines, that, my friend, is very seldom unimportant. Chapter 7. Miriam's fear. Poirot asked to speak with Miriam alone, and for the first time her composure cracked. Until then she had borne herself with a rigid discipline that was almost impressive. She had been pale, certainly, and strained, but she had continued to speak with correctness, to sit upright, to arrange her hands, and to answer questions as though good breeding might yet defend her from disaster. Poirot, however, had already seen what lay beneath. Mrs. Voss was not merely distressed by her brother's death. She had been afraid long before it. He chose the morning room for the interview, a small chamber overlooking the wet lawn, quiet and enclosed, with none of the oppressive associations now attached to the study. The fire had burned low outside. The garden looked colorless under a sky the shade of old pewter. Within, the silence seemed gentler than elsewhere in the house, and perhaps for that reason more dangerous to evasion. Poirot drew a chair for her. Madame Voss, he said, you have courage, but you do not yet have honesty. Let us try for both. She gave a weary, almost bitter smile. You are very direct, Mr. Poirot. Number, I am economical. The truth has already lost too much time. For a moment she did not answer. Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened over one another. Then she said, in a low voice, he wrote to me, Jonah Reed. It was, I think, a relief to her, merely to say the name aloud. She had carried it too long in silence. The letter, she confessed, had arrived 3 days earlier. It had not come by post in the ordinary way, but had been delivered by hand to the village, then brought to the house among other correspondence. She had recognized the handwriting at once, though she had not seen it in 5 years. The message was short, intense, and unmistakable. Jonah Reed wrote that he was coming to Brackenmere. He wrote that he had endured enough exile and disgrace. He wrote that before he left again he would claim truth, money, and justice. Poirot repeated the phrase softly. Truth, money, and justice. A curious order. She looked up. Curious. Yes, men usually ask first for money, then for justice, and only very rarely for truth. Her face quivered. Jonah was never ordinary. She had hidden the letter from Harold. That fact came out next, and with it the deeper motive beneath her fear. It was not merely scandal she had dreaded, though that mattered to her greatly. It was also memory. Jonah Reed had once wished to marry her. Before the collapse of the business, before accusation and disappearance, he had been close to the household. Harold had approved him once, perhaps never warmly, but sufficiently. Then came the financial ruin, the blame, the savage quarrel, and the vanishing. To acknowledge Jonah's return now would mean reopening not only a scandal but a personal wound she had spent years teaching herself not to feel. "I thought," she said, staring at the dying fire, "that if I said nothing, perhaps he would not come, or if he did, I might speak to him first." Quietly, before Harold knew. "And did you intend to help him?" That question shook her. "I do not know," she whispered. "I think I wanted to know whether he had lied then, or whether Harold had." Poirot did not press that at once. He let the silence hold. "Yet Harold learned of the letter," he said at last. "Yes. How?" "I cannot be certain. He may have seen it among my papers. He may have guessed from my manner. He always noticed more than one wished him to." "What did he say?" Her fingers tightened. "He was furious. Not frightened at first. Furious, then later, in the afternoon, he became calm in a way I disliked. Far more, he said the matter would be settled. He said the fourth place was to be laid because if Jonah meant to come like a ghost from the grave, then he should sit in the light and be dealt with before the night ended." Poirot's eyes sharpened. Those were his words. Almost exactly. Dealt with, an interesting phrase. "It frightened me, yes," said Poirot. "It should have done." She admitted then that she had changed the seating herself just before dinner. Mrs. Greeley had already told us that much, but not the reason. Miriam now explained it with visible reluctance. "I did not want Edwin opposite Harold," she said, "nor Jonah, if he came, beside Edwin." Why? Because Edwin was nervous already. Harold had spoken sharply to him that afternoon. I thought if they were too near one another, something would show. Poirot leaned slightly forward. "You feared Mr. Marsh knew of Reed's coming?" "Yes." "And did he?" "I think so." That too explained something. She had not been rearranging seats out of feminine impulse or social habit. She had been arranging tension, trying to contain where eyes would fall, and who would be forced into direct confrontation. "After dinner," said Poirot, "did you enter the study?" The answer was immediate but not careless. She had expected the question. "You are certain?" "Quite certain." "You did not speak to your brother alone?" "Did you hear anything?" At this she hesitated, and I saw Poirot note it. "Yes," she said finally. "I heard voices. Low, angry voices. I could not distinguish every word, but one was Harold's and the other was Edwin's." Poirot was still. "Not Jonah Reed's. Edwin's." "Where were you?" "In the corridor outside the drawing room. I had gone back for my handkerchief." The study door was not fully shut. "What did you hear?" "Only fragments." Harold said something like, "You have no right," Edwin said. "He has every right." Then I moved away. I did not wish to hear more. Poirot's expression altered very slightly. It was not surprise, but the satisfaction of a line moving into place. "Did they know you were there?" "I do not think so." "And later?" "Later came the cry." She lifted a hand to her face then, and for the first time all morning her control visibly failed. "I did not kill my brother," she said, not as a challenge, but as a plea against the shape events were taking. "But I think everyone in that house was afraid of what he had done," Poirot answered very gently. "That is not the same thing, madame." Then came the final detail. It emerged almost by accident, though with Poirot nothing important is ever entirely accidental. He asked when Edwin Marsh had first entered Harold's professional affairs. She said only months earlier. He asked whether Harold had known him long before that. She said no. Then, After a pause, she added, "But Edwin had known Jonah Reed." Poirot lifted his head. "How?" "He worked for him years ago, before the collapse. He was a junior clerk in the office. That changed everything. Until then, Edwin Marsh had seemed merely a nervous solicitor who had stumbled upon dangerous papers. Now he became something else, a living link between Harold Wexley and the vanished Jonah Reed, not by recent discovery only, but by old allegiance. Did Harold know this? Poirot asked. Yes, he pretended it did not matter. And did it? Miriam gave a bleak little laugh. In this house, Mr. Poirot, everything old seems to have mattered in the end. Poirot rose and walked slowly to the window. For some moments he said nothing. The wet garden lay still outside. The paths dark, the shrubs heavy with rain. When he turned back, his face had that grave, inward look I had learned to recognize. The pieces were not yet complete, but they had begun to obey one another. "Ah," he said very quietly. Then the dead man had not 3 guests only. He had dined with his past. Miriam looked at him with something between fear and relief. "You think Edwin brought Jonah here?" Poirot shook his head. "I think the past never needs to be brought. One need only prepare a place for it. When we left the room, he said to me in the corridor, 'Observe Hastings, how the case changes. First we had a missing man, then a secret letter, then the old fraud. Now we learn that Edwin Marsh once served Jonah Reed and argued with Wexley before the death. Very good. The circle tightens. You suspect Marsh?" Poirot gave me one of his sidelong glances. "I suspect everyone who has found a reason to fear the truth, but I begin to think this murder was not committed to keep Jonah Reed out. It was committed because, in one way or another, he had already returned." Chapter 8. The man in the village inn. Poirot took me the next morning to the King's Arms, the only inn by the station. It stood just beyond the low stone wall of the platform road, a squat, weathered building with a sagging signboard and 2 narrow upper windows that stared down upon the lane with the expression of old servants who have seen too much and remember more than they say. The rain of the previous night had washed the village clean without making it cheerful. The sky remained colorless. The road shone darkly. From the station yard came the smell of wet coal, damp timber, and horses. Poirot had been unusually silent on the drive there. When I asked whether he truly believed Jonah Reed had lodged at the inn, he gave me one of those sidelong glances that always suggested both amusement and correction. "I believe, Hastings, that when a man announces he will come, somebody must either receive him, avoid him, or pretend to be him. The inn by the station is the natural place for all 3. The landlord of the King's Arms was a broad man with reddish cheeks, a flattened watch, chain across his waistcoat, and the cautious manner of one who understands that police inquiries are bad for business, whether the house is innocent or not. He had already spoken to Inspector Bell and wore the air of a man determined to say nothing twice unless compelled. Poirot, however, by some quiet alchemy of manner, succeeded within 5 minutes in making him both cooperative and eager to appear useful. "Yes, sir," he said, rubbing his chin. "A gentleman took the upstairs back room 2 nights ago. Wrote the name John Ray in the book, paid in cash. No luggage to speak of, only a small case left in a hurry before dawn." "Before dawn today?" asked Poirot. "Yes, sir. Very early." "And his appearance?" The landlord narrowed his eyes in recollection. Middle height, hard sort of face. Quiet, kept his hat low even indoors, which I thought odd. There was a scar near the ear on the left side, old one, I'd say. "A scar," repeated Poirot softly. "And the voice. Educated enough, but careful, like a man who doesn't wish to be remembered by it. Yet you remember him very well." The landlord gave a grim little smile. "Men who don't want to be remembered generally make one remember them." Poirot asked whether the supposed John Ray had received visitors. The landlord hesitated. "Not that I can swear to, sir. But last evening, not long before supper, another gentleman came in and asked whether a person from London had taken a room. Inspector Bell, who had insisted on joining us, and now stood with arms folded by the door, said at once, 'Did you know that gentleman?' No, sir. Could it have been Mr. Marsh? The landlord looked uncomfortable. Maybe. I wouldn't like to say for certain. Bell made a note as though uncertainty itself were good enough. Poirot only asked, "And you told this second gentleman?" "That there was a guest, yes, but I did not give the name." "Excellent," said Poirot. "You have more discretion than many diplomats." We were shown upstairs to the room. It was small and meanly furnished, with an iron bedstead, a washstand, a narrow wardrobe, and a table placed under the window. The curtains smelled faintly of stale tobacco. Nothing remained of the occupant but the impression of a man who had lived there without resting in it. Bell at once searched like a terrier, opening drawers, peering beneath the bed, examining the grate. Poirot, on the other hand, moved slowly and with an odd tenderness, as though the room had something fragile to reveal and must not be bullied into it. The first object he found was in the waste paper basket. It was a torn envelope, carefully folded upon itself once and then ripped across the middle, as though the writer had thought belatedly of destroying it, and had done so in haste. Poirot pieced the halves together on the table. The name was clear enough: Jonah Reed. No address remained except the faint beginning of a London district, and no contents were inside. Bell gave a short exclamation of triumph. "There you are. Reed was here." Poirot did not look up. "No, Inspector. An envelope addressed to Jonah Reed was here." "It is not yet the same thing," Bell snorted. "You'd argue with a signpost." "Sometimes," said Poirot calmly, "especially when it points too helpfully." The next discovery lay in the table drawer, a telegraph receipt from Brackenmere station office. Time stamped the previous evening. The message had been sent to Harold Wexley at Wexley House. It contained only 3 words and an hour. Tonight, 8:30, alone. I felt a distinct chill. "Then Harold knew," I said. "He expected a meeting." "Certainly," said Poirot. "And now we know why the extra place at table was laid with such intention." Bell's satisfaction deepened. "The fellow summons Wexley, comes to the house, there's trouble, and Wexley ends dead. We're getting somewhere at last." Poirot folded the telegraph receipt and slipped it into his pocket. "Yes," he said. "But whether we are going in the right direction is another matter." The room yielded one final object. Near the skirting board beneath the bed, where it might have rolled unnoticed, Poirot found a cuff button of blackened silver, engraved with the initials Arm. Bell almost laughed aloud. "Marsh, that settles it." He turned to me as though seeking confirmation from the room itself. "Your nervous solicitor meets the missing partner here. They arrange something, perhaps extortion, perhaps revenge, and then either together or separately Wexley gets killed." Poirot balanced the cuff button on his palm. "Does it settle it, Inspector?" Bell stared at him. "What more do you want? We have Reed's name, a telegram to Wexley, and Marsh's button in the man's room." Poirot smiled faintly. "It proves instead that someone wished Edwin Marsh to appear already guilty before he had even been accused." Bell flushed. "That's nonsense. Number it is psychology." He laid the button beside the torn envelope. "Observe the generosity of these clues. We are invited to conclude not merely that Jonah Reed was here, but that Edwin Marsh met him. The envelope names Reed, the telegram links the room to Wexley, the cuff button links the room to Marsh. Each clue politely explains the next. That, my dear Inspector, is not the usual behavior of truth. It is the behavior of arrangement." Bell objected that men in haste leave things behind. "Yes," said Poirot, "one thing, perhaps two. But when every surviving item points in exactly the same direction, I begin to suspect curation. Why preserve the most incriminating objects and destroy nothing? Why leave the receipt in the drawer, the envelope in the basket, the button under the bed? It is too complete. Real guilt is often untidy in the wrong places. False guilt is very tidy in the right ones." That silenced Bell. Though unwillingly, we brought Edwin Marsh to the inn an hour later. When shown the cuff button, he went visibly white. "It is mine," he said after a dreadful pause. "Or one of mine? I had a pair made last winter." Bell pounced at once. "And how did one come to be here?" "I don't know." You expect us to believe that. It is the truth. Poirot watched him very carefully. Have you ever been to this room before today, Mr. Marsh? Number, did you meet anyone at the King's Arms last night? Number, did you send or receive a telegram concerning Harold Wexley? Number, Marsh spoke with desperation. But not, I thought. With invention, his fear was genuine. Whether innocence produced it or merely the collapse of a scheme, I could not tell. Poirot seemed less interested in the words than in the order of his alarm. Marsh had looked first at the cuff button, then at the receipt, and only lastly at the torn envelope. That sequence, I knew, would mean something to Poirot later. As we left the inn, Bell said sharply, "You're protecting him." Poirot shook his head. "Not at all. I am protecting the facts from premature marriage." "The facts are plain." "Nothing is plain," said Poirot, "except that someone has been at work before us. The false name, John Ray, the scarred man, the telegram, the planted association with Edwin Marsh. It is a trail, yes, but I do not yet know whether it leads toward Jonah Reed or away from him." He paused near the station gate and looked back at the inn windows. "My friend," he said to me, "what interests me most is this. If the man in the room was Jonah Reed, why hide under another name and then leave behind an envelope that names him? And if he was not Jonah Reed, who benefits by creating the shadow of his presence at exactly the moment Harold Wexley dies?" The station bell rang faintly across the wet morning air. For the first time, I began to suspect that the missing man who dominated the case might not be the figure moving through it at all, but only the silhouette someone else had chosen to cast. Poirot, seeing perhaps that the same thought had at last reached me, gave a small approving nod. "Yes, Hastings," he said, "at last you perceive it. We are no longer looking for one man. We are looking for the author of an appearance." Chapter 9. The fourth seat explained that evening. Poirot gathered us all again in the dining room, with the table set exactly as before. It was one of those gestures of his that might have seemed theatrical in another man. Yet in Poirot never felt like theatre for its own sake. He understood better than anyone that people are governed, not only by facts but by arrangement. Place them again among the objects of their fear, and memory begins to loosen what pride has tied down. So the candles were lit, the silver replaced, and the table restored with exacting care to the pattern of the fatal evening. Even the fourth place stood once more prepared, the chair slightly withdrawn, the napkin folded, the glass waiting. Inspector Bell disliked the scene at once. He disliked being made to sit where a detective, rather than a policeman, controlled the order of attention. Edwin Marsh came in pale and hollow. Aide Miriam Voss entered last, and stopped for the briefest instant at the threshold when she saw the table. That small pause did not escape Poirot. We took our seats. Poirot remained standing. "You observe," he said, resting one hand lightly on the back of the empty chair, "that we return to the beginning. That is often the best way of approaching the end." Bell said impatiently, "You asked us here to name the murderer, I hope, not to admire linen." Poirot inclined his head. "But it is precisely the linen, Inspector, that has helped to betray the falsehood." He turned to the fourth seat. "This place was never intended for Jonah Reed to occupy." The words produced an immediate stir. Marsh looked up sharply. Bell frowned. Miriam's fingers tightened around one another in her lap. Poirot continued in that calm, exact voice of his, which always seemed gentlest when it was most dangerous. Everything about this place invited one conclusion, that Jonah Reed had been expected. The hidden note beneath the plate, the family unease, the old scandal, the note at the inn, the telegram, all invited us to think of one absent man. And that precisely is why I say this seat was not laid for him to sit in. It was laid so that everyone present would think of Jonah Reed, fear Jonah Reed, and later blame Jonah Reed. Inspector Bell made a dismissive sound. "You're splitting hairs. Wexley did expect Reed." "Yes," said Poirot, "but not here, not formally, not before witnesses." He moved away from the table and faced us all. "Harold Wexley expected Jonah Reed in secret. We know that now, He had ordered the old pantry passage left accessible. He had cash ready in the desk. He had marked the railway timetable. He intended a private interview, not a public reunion over soup and fish. The formal dinner setting, therefore, was pure theatre. Belle was forced to consider that. Miriam spoke at last, her voice strained but steady. If Harold expected Jonah secretly, who laid that place to suggest otherwise? Poirot looked at her. That, madame, is exactly the right question. He picked up the folded napkin from the fourth place and set it down again with precision. The note beneath the plate did not summon Harold Wexley at all. It was planted after the table had been laid, by someone who wished the extra place to acquire drama. 5 words only. I am coming tonight. Wait. No signature, no hour, no direct address. It was not a practical message. It was a symbolic one. It existed to be found. Edwin Marsh said hoarsely, but it was hidden. Yes, said Poirot, hidden badly. Hidden where a cautious servant might uncover it, or where an observant guest might notice the disturbance. And in this house there happened, by good fortune for the writer, to be a certain Belgian detective whose eye is known to miss very little. That brought silence. I confess that until he said it, I had not fully understood the audacity of the move. The note had not merely conveyed information, it had been bait. Poirot turned again toward Miriam Voss. Only one person had both the opportunity to alter the table and the motive to direct suspicion away from herself, you, madame. She gave a little gasp. Belle sat forward at once. Marsh half rose from his chair, but Poirot lifted one finger, and such was the authority of the gesture that both men stopped, as if checked by command. You, madame, he said quietly, are guilty of deception, but not of murder. The relief that crossed her face was so swift and so painful that it was almost worse than confession. She bowed her head. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak. Poirot continued, not unkindly. You received Jonah Reed's letter 3 days ago. You hid it. You feared scandal, yes, but more than scandal. You feared the reopening of the old wound, the old fraud, the old accusation against your brother. When you learned that Harold had somehow discovered the matter and meant to deal with Reed that evening, you panicked. You changed the seating before dinner, then you placed the note beneath the extra plate. Why? Because you wanted one thing fixed in every mind before anything else could happen. The return of Jonah Reed. Miriam raised her head slowly. Yes, she whispered. Belle said sharply, why do that unless she meant to cover the murder? Poirot answered without turning, because she feared it before it happened. Not the exact murder, perhaps, but violence, scandal, catastrophe. She wished the house to see Jonah Reed as the cause of all disturbance. If anything occurred later, suspicion would naturally move toward the absent man, not toward the family, and certainly not toward herself. Miriam spoke now with sudden, exhausted frankness. I thought if Jonah came and there was a scene, if Harold humiliated him, or paid him, or threatened him, then everyone would understand it was because of their old quarrel. I wanted the reason in the room before the event. I wanted no one looking elsewhere. Elsewhere, said Poirot. Her eyes flickered toward Edwin Marsh and then away. That glance told Belle more than any speech. Ah, said Poirot softly, you feared not only for yourself or your brother, but for Mr. Marsh. Edwin stood abruptly. This is intolerable. No, said Poirot. It is exact. He fixed Marsh with his gaze. Mrs. Voss knew you had once worked under Jonah Reed. She knew you had discovered old papers that damaged Harold Wexley. She heard you argue with him before dinner. She feared that if violence came, suspicion might fall inside the house, and perhaps upon you, by planting the note and emphasizing Jonah Reed's shadow, she attempted to direct attention outward. Miriam clasped her hands against her breast. I did not mean anyone to die, I swear it. I only wanted the truth, if it came, to come attached to Jonah and not to Edwin. Belle stared at her. Then you were protecting Marsh. She did not answer. She did not need to. Poirot spoke gently, though with no softness toward falsehood itself. You see, Inspector, why the fourth place matters. not because it welcomed a guest, but because it instructed the witnesses. It told them what to think. That is why it was arranged so carefully. That is why the note was phrased so dramatically. That is why the setting stood opposite Harold, where all could notice it. It was a suggestion planted before the crime. He touched the back of the empty chair again. This chair was not waiting for Jonah Reed. It was waiting for our imagination. Bell looked dissatisfied but unsettled. He had expected accusation to end in handcuffs. He was being offered a subtler species of guilt and did not yet know where to place it. "If she's not the murderer," he said, "then why expose this now?" Poirot's eyes moved from Miriam to Edwin and then to the empty place itself. "Because until we understand the false construction, we cannot see the true one, Mrs. Voss manufactured expectation. Someone else manufactured death. The two acts are connected, but they are not the same," Miriam said in a faint voice. "You know who killed Harold." Poirot's expression changed. It grew more inward, more grave. "Yes," he said, "I know." He let the silence deepen. No one moved. The candles burned steadily. The fourth glass shone untouched, as it had on the night of murder. Yet now it seemed less ominous than pitiful, a place laid not for a man but for fear. Poirot looked at each of us in turn. "The extra seat is explained," he said. "It was not set for the dead partner. It was set for suspicion. And now that suspicion has served its purpose, we may dismiss it and invite the murderer to take his proper place." Chapter 10. The true killer Poirot turned at last to Edwin Marsh, whose face had become grey as ash. Until that moment Marsh had endured rather than listened. He had sat rigidly, one hand gripping the table edge, his eyes moving only when forced, like those of a man who has already heard his own sentence in the privacy of his conscience, and now waits merely for it to be spoken aloud. But when Poirot looked at him fully, something inside him seemed to give way. It was not yet confession. It was the collapse of hope. "No," he said. It was a weak word, breath more than argument. Poirot answered with grave gentleness. "Yes, Mr. Marsh." Inspector Bell shifted forward at once. Eager, but Poirot lifted a hand and kept command of the room. "Let us be exact," he said. "This case began, not with a blow in the study, but years ago in the office of a failing firm. Jonah Reed was not the rogue history made him. He was the sacrifice. Harold Wexley, facing ruin, arranged the account so that suspicion and liability would fall upon his partner. Reed vanished because to remain would mean disgrace, prosecution, perhaps prison, and no one to defend him. Wexley rebuilt his name upon the wreck of another man's life." Marsh shut his eyes. "You knew Reed then," said Poirot. "You were not yet a solicitor. You were his clerk. A junior man, observant, loyal and powerless. Later, when you came into Harold Wexley's service and reviewed old legal papers, you recognized what had been done, the hidden transfers, the deliberate shifting of losses, the shape of the fraud. It was not only a professional discovery, it was the return of an old injustice." Marsh's lips moved. I wanted him to answer. "Yes," said Poirot, "that is the important thing. You did not at first want murder. You wanted reckoning." He turned slightly so that all of us, not Marsh alone, were drawn into the final design. "You arranged Jonah Reed's return. You sent word, or answered it. You helped create the meeting. That is why the inn yields a trail leading toward you, though too neatly, because you were indeed connected, but not in the crude manner the planted evidence suggests. You expected confrontation, perhaps confession, perhaps payment. You believed that if Reed stood alive before Wexley, the old lie would crack." Miriam Voss had gone deathly still, Bell said. "Then Reed came to the house?" "Yes," said Poirot, "by the hidden pantry passage. Harold had left it available for that very purpose. He did not want the man announced at the front door like an equal. He wanted secrecy and control." That word seemed to strike Miriam physically. Poirot continued. "Reed came. There was an encounter before dinner, overheard in fragments. Harold called someone a fool for coming back. That was true, but the interview did not end the matter. Later, after dinner, Reed was again near the study, whether he had returned to it or never gone far from it. There was a second confrontation. This time Harold struck first. Bell frowned. With the bronze horse. The bronze horse killed Harold. Reed was attacked before that. Likely with another object or by force in the struggle itself. There were signs of a struggle not accounted for by Wexley alone, and signs of movement toward the window, not consistent with the final staging. Jonah Reed, wounded and desperate, fled into the night, I said. Then Reed did not kill Wexley. No, Hastings. Reed was the ghost everyone feared, but not the hand that delivered death. Poirot's eyes returned to Marsh. You entered the study after Reed had gone. Perhaps you had heard enough already. Perhaps you came because you feared violence and found its aftermath. Harold Wexley was shaken but alive, and then, because vanity survives where mercy does not. He spoke. He admitted the old fraud, or enough of it. He boasted, perhaps, that even now Jonah Reed would never be believed. Respectability was on his side. The exile, the scarred man, the ruined partner, who would trust him against the master of Wexley House. Marsh stood up suddenly. Yes, he cried, and the word seemed torn out of him. Yes, he said that. He said Jonah could come back from the grave itself, and still no one would choose him over Harold Wexley. He laughed. Do you understand? He laughed. His voice broke. For years that man lived under a lie. For years he carried what should have been Wexley's shame, and Wexley stood there, untouched by it, pleased with it, proud of it. He said Jonah had been useful precisely because he was weak enough to run. Poirot did not interrupt. Marsh pressed both hands to the table, leaning over it like a man at the edge of collapse. I had not meant, God help me, I had not meant it to go so far. I wanted him cornered. I wanted the truth spoken. But when he said that, when he made it sound clever, almost amusing, something in me, he stopped, swallowed, and said the rest very low. I took the bronze horse from the desk and struck him. No one spoke. The confession, once made, changed the room utterly. Miriam bowed her head. Bell moved instinctively as if to arrest him at once, but even he hesitated before the naked misery of the man. Edwin Marsh no longer looked frightened. He looked emptied. In fury, said Poirot softly, and in long-nursed loyalty. Marsh nodded once. Yes. Bell stepped forward then, but Poirot raised a hand again. Not the act itself, perhaps, but enough. You knew Harold was dead or as good as dead. Reed had vanished, and Edwin was entangled beyond rescue. So you did what frightened people do when they have lived too long in the shadow of scandal. You arranged appearances. You planted the note beneath the plate. You preserved the significance of the fourth seat. You wished every mind in the house, and later the police, to move first toward Jonah Reed. She looked up through tears she had fought all day to avoid. Yes, she whispered. I knew Edwin had done something dreadful. I did not know whether Jonah lived. I thought if suspicion followed Jonah, there might be time. Time for reason, for some mercy, for something. For concealment, said Bell bluntly. Miriam accepted that with a slight nod. Yes. Poirot's voice remained calm, but not cold. You are guilty of deception, madam. Grave deception, but not of murder. Then he spoke almost as though summing up to himself, though every word fell with perfect clarity. One murder, one cover-up, and one ghost from the past, seated at dinner though never seen. That is the pattern. Harold Wexley invited his past into the house through a hidden passage, intending mastery. Jonah Reed came seeking truth, money, and justice, and fled after the struggle, wounded but alive. Edwin Marsh, who had served the ruined man long ago, and carried his grievance like a deferred debt, found Wexley alive, arrogant, and unrepentant. In that moment, loyalty became rage, and rage became murder. Afterward, Miriam, hearing enough to recognize catastrophe, turned the table itself into an instrument of misdirection. Bell at last put a hand on Marsh's shoulder. The younger man did not resist. Poirot looked once more at the empty fourth chair. My friend, he said to me, and there was in his tone that sadness which always came when justice and pity had to stand together. That is why the fourth chair was the loudest voice in the room. No one answered him. The candles burned low. The unused glass before the empty place caught the light and held it silently, as it had on the first night. Yet now it no longer suggested expectation. It suggested judgment. The chair had belonged to no visible guest, and yet everything had been said from it: fear, memory, guilt, the return of the buried past, and the fatal folly of believing one may ruin a man and never dine with the consequences. Tidwin Marsh went out with Inspector Bell. Miriam remained seated, looking not at Poirot, but at the vacant place opposite her brother's former seat. I think she saw there not Jonah Reed, nor Edwin, nor even Harold, but the whole wasted tragedy of years that might have been spoken honestly and never were. Poirot, before leaving the room, reached out and pushed the fourth chair gently back beneath the table. It was the smallest of gestures. It felt like the end.